Well, it's a great pleasure having Craig and Cindy and Sarah here with us. And Sarit, Michaeli from Bצלם. I'm Michael Sfard. We are aware of the late hour and we'll try to keep it short, but I'm sure all of you came here to express our solidarity with the Corrie family and to hear them. So what we'll have now is a short conversation, and then we'll open up for a few questions and comments from the audience. I think I'll start by, I'm still with a lump in my throat. I'm not used to be so moved when I ask questions. Naturally, this play is a very important play that plays a role in your life, and you saw it many times and heard it many times, but it's the first time you hear it in Hebrew. Was it bizarre for you?
It's very moving for me to be here with all of you and to hear it in Hebrew. We knew about it happening last year. We heard from Ari, and we heard about some of the questions being asked around the production and so forth. But it's very powerful to be here with friends and with some of you that we don't know, and I think that we're very conscious of the fact that it's different here than it is where we've seen it in many other places. And so we've always thought that Rachel could tell her story best in her own words. She had a gift with words. And so I'm just glad that they've come here, and I'm so grateful to everybody that's made that possible.
I'm moved too. And there are only about a dozen words that I could pick out there and understand, but I know the story well, and it was so incredibly well acted. I found it really moving. I remember the part about "Come Here." I remember when the play was first sort of drafted, and Rachel wrote it for 10 "Come Heres" in there, and I think Ellen Rickman only put in a couple, and I asked him to put in all 10 because it'd be so hard to do all of that, and he did it tonight. It seemed to me, that was just one little piece that I thought that baby took with me. So anyway, yeah. Special.
I actually haven't seen the play in many years. I think my parents have seen it much more frequently than I have. I saw the London production, the New York production, and a lot of people know there was controversy around just bringing it to New York, and so it meant a lot for me to be there. And then I saw one production in Seattle, and the same actress did it in Olympia. But for me, the first time I saw the play in London, we're sitting in the theater and hearing Rachel's words, and it was the first time I felt like I'd had my whole family together in a long time again. And so tonight, this is a very different experience than sitting in a courtroom. We've been through that process, and anybody that knows me knows in a courtroom I can handle almost anything. So you'll have to forgive me a little bit. It is very emotional to be here, and I'm just very grateful that this happened and that it allowed some of Rachel and the person that she is to come through, because it's something that we've all said has been very hard in our court process to get her voice into the courtroom. Very important to us.
Well, speaking of courtrooms, well, I'm sure most of the audience know that one of the reasons you're visiting Israel these days is because the day after tomorrow, the appeal, your appeal, will be heard in the Israeli Supreme Court. And in 2 sentences, you have filed a civil claim, which was dismissed in the district court on the basis of a law that prescribes a very wide definition of the immunity of act of war. And the state of Israel has invoked that defense of an act of war, and the claim was dismissed. Now you're appealing to the Supreme Court with a fantastic attorney, Hussein Abu Hussein, my dear friend. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, why did you take this case? What is the goal, and what are your expectations in the Israeli court?
So I'm interpreting that as why even sue at all, and then, or why appeal, which I'm not
You
sure.
heard the subtext.
Oh, okay. So you have a little feel of what we lost. And when that happens to a family, you want answers. You want to know how it could happen. You want accountability for how it happened. And the day after Rachel was killed, Prime Minister Sharon promised President Bush a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation into the killing of our daughter. And it's not just our family's opinion, but it's even still the position of the U.S. government that did not happen. We pressed to get that sort of answers through diplomatic means, but in 2 years, the statute of limitations run out, and so we filed this lawsuit one day before it ran out. And the civil lawsuit is the only process that we as a family can control and push forward to try to get this accountability and the answers. I think in terms of appeal, I think we'd all have different feelings about all this, but I think you should go through this process. And you try to sort of use the process to get answers, then you find out the process doesn't always work all that well, then it morphs slowly into being a lot more about trying to improve the process. And so in terms of an appeal, we really feel like it's an egregious sort of interpretation of that law. And that needs to be challenged. And so, of course, we're still looking for accountability, but we can't give up at this step. We have to say that was wrong. And I hope that the High Court will reverse this real impunity that they grant to the Israeli Defense Force. But if that doesn't happen, then I hope that we can at least bring it out in the open, what doesn't happen.
I'll just add that that during the course of the trial, there were 15 sessions. Some of you were at some of those sessions. We heard from 23 witnesses, a large number of military witnesses, and there were some things that were fairly startling, coming from the lead investigator in the case. Was the statement that it was his personal belief that that the IDF was at war with everyone in Gaza, including the peace activists. And from another fairly high-level officer came the statement that there are no civilians in war. So I feel like, in terms of an outcome, I really hope that that we come away with some decision again, or some statement that reinforces here the importance of the protections that under international law are afforded to civilians, whether they be human rights observers or nonviolent protesters or journalists or the civilians who are living in these places. And my belief is that if that happens, then we are all much safer, and that the soldiers who are out there doing things are much safer, that everyone is. So I would hope, I'm an optimistic person, so I'm hopeful that there may be something that moves in that direction.
Maybe I'm naive, but did you ever get any official condolences, not to say apology, from any Israeli official? maybe not through the court proceedings, through diplomatic means?
I think it was the day after Rachel was killed, and Cindy and I were living on the East Coast. Our son flew us to Washington, D.C., and we thought we would come here. And so we were at our son's house, and what's his name?
Yossi Amran.
Who was the Consul General for the Pacific Northwest. So he was the Israeli Consul General in San Francisco, and he called my son's house. He thought he was talking to me, but he was talking to my son, to convey his condolences. And then in early August, Cindy and I were in San Francisco, and we were in his office. And he explained to us that that was not the government of Israel saying that. That was personal. I found it astounding that somebody in the diplomatic corps, who's not supposed to ever say anything that's personal, would say something's personal and then come back and explain that it was personal later. Other people, individuals have acted. When we first came to Israel, the ambassador to the United States had said, if you ever come to Israel, give me a call, I'll help you, like he was going to be our, tour agent or something. And so when we decided to come, I called his secretary and said, I only need one thing from him, get us into Gaza. And a person that did work for him, and I believe is much higher in the diplomatic corps here now, Alana Spies, called back a few days later. And it's not really what he said, but he just couldn't talk at first when I answered the phone. And we've met since then. So there's some personal warmth in some of those cases, but certainly nothing official in that sense.
I'll turn now to you, Sarit. You're both the spokeswoman for Bצלם and a long-time activist yourself. And the question is, when I say we, I do mean Israelis, did we learn anything from this awful event? According to the information that gathered in Bצלם and known to you, is it safer today for human rights defenders, for activists to protest in Palestinian areas?
I was thinking about what my answer would be. I was trying to think whether nowadays things are calmer because there's any kind of official restrictions or placed on the conduct of soldiers in these kinds of situations of protest, of direct action, or whether the reason is only purely that things are calmer generally throughout the West Bank and Gaza, and therefore the level of violence is lower. And for that reason, of course, there's less danger. And it's very hard to give an answer, but I think that in a sense, this is my personal subjective feeling, and I think it's echoed throughout, amongst activists. Things have become worse in a sense. I mean, we haven't had, luckily, anyone killed within these situations of a person taking, on a kind of a direct activist role for a while. But Palestinians, of course, are killed on a regular basis during clashes in the West Bank, but also during confrontations and demonstrations that don't involve any kind of violation of, or that don't involve circumstances that justify the use of lethal force. Only last week, 2 young Palestinians were killed near the Ofra prison near Ramallah. I'm sure most people here are familiar with the incident. But if maybe to kind of echo this dual response of the authorities, on the other hand, of course, not investigating, not dealing with the root causes of the killing, not trying to understand why and whether anyone needs to be held accountable, but then also denying and kind of rejecting even the responsibility. The Israeli army actually denied even that live ammunition was fired during that incident. When we have 2 youths killed and another one seriously injured through the use of live ammunition. So I suppose the answer is that we've learned a lot. We learned how to be better at, when I say we, I mean the human rights community. We learned how to be better at providing these cases, following these cases, maybe doing some more, using the media and using social networks to distribute information. But in terms of how the authorities have dealt with them, I think they learned a lot about how to cover them up and how to, whitewash and use foot dragging and time wasting in order to reach no conclusion ever. And this is something I'm sure it's part of your work as well.
And if I may add, I think the numbers, the figures, the constant figures show that human rights organizations here in Israel collect that impunity stays in the same very high figures throughout the last decade, and not much has changed in the sense of bringing people responsible for such atrocities to justice. So I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. If anyone has a comment or question, please, welcome. I think people are still in. Yes, Adam.
I just wanted to say, if she was anything like this play described her, then she was a person which I would have liked to meet, regardless of politics.
Thank you.
And the play is, all her words. That's taken from her journals and her emails, and of course translated. But so that's Rachel, on sort of channel.
It's a wonderful, for those of you that don't know, when she was killed, she had sent these emails, home to us and to her family and friends, and they had had such an impact on us because, we were, I think, a typical U.S. family. We didn't have direct connections here, and the narrative that we really knew and understood was the Israeli-Jewish narrative, and that's the one that we related to. And so the whole process of her coming here was, challenging and made us stop, and she tried to help us learn before she came here, as she was learning more and more. But then when she started to write, and we knew how much her words mattered to her, and what a careful observer she was, and the things that she was writing that you heard tonight, took it to another place for us. I remember asking my son, who lived in the East Coast, lived in Washington, D.C., what he thought, and he said, it's a perspective I do not hear here. And so when she was killed, she says in the play, I think you heard it, because again, I don't understand all the Hebrew, but that she wanted to get the word out. She didn't phone to me that message, but she emailed it to me about wanting to be careful. She thought maybe our local newspaper would publish a family interest story about her coming, and they didn't do that while she was living. But she wanted me to be careful if they called me up. She thought that I shouldn't mess things up too badly. And so we thought the moment when the word came to us, actually a cousin of Craig's called in the first hour. He just needed to hear our voices, and I said to him, we have to get her words out, because I knew how important that was. She wanted to be a witness. And so we released those emails, made them public, and they were picked up very shortly. In the first few days, the Guardian newspaper asked if they could print part of it. And then they called again and they said, it's been so long since we've seen anything that so humanizes the situation in Gaza, and we'd like to run them all, which is what they did. And then a friend of Alan Rickman's, the actor, took them to him, and he then took them to the Royal Court Theatre. And my email crashed in the first day or so. I have an AOL account, and we got 10,000 emails, some of them from people here that were of tremendous help to us. And, but anyway, I wasn't even looking at email, but my sisters were. I'm the oldest of 6, and they were helping. And this email came from the royal court saying they sent their condolences, but they were interested in the writing. And so my sisters just wrote back and thanked them. And then nothing happened really for a long time, but in September of 2003, Craig and I came here for our first trip, really even out of the U.S. We hadn't traveled very much. And on the way back, by that time, Tom Herndal, another international, he was severely injured on the same border strip within 2 miles of where Rachel was killed, also James Miller. And we had connected with the Herndal family. And so on our stop coming back from here and our first trip to Gaza, to Israel, to the West Bank, we stopped in London to connect with the Herndals. And my sister said, will you go to the Royal Court Theatre? And so we said, okay, but we were completely here. I mean, it was, all of our energy was here, the energy that we had. But we went there, and my sister set up an appointment. There were about 7 people sitting in the room. And when we came, Craig said to them, well, there's more writing. And they said they'd be interested in looking at it. They never said there'd be a play or anything, just that they do workshops and that kind of thing. And we said, well, we'll get you more writing. And then we left, and Craig said, we're supposed to know the name of that guy that was sitting in the back of the room with a very deep voice. And that was, and then later he said, Sense and Sensibility, the movie. It was Alan Rickman. And then we were really living moment to moment, day to day, doing the next thing. We didn't send the writing. But then Tom Herndal died, and we were invited to go back to London to speak in an event for things that were getting started in his memory. And Sarah came along, and Alan Rickman was at this gathering, and then we apologized for not getting any writing. He said, that's fine, there's no pressure, you know, it's just if it feels like a good thing to do. And then Sarah said, I'll get the writing to you, which she was true to her promise, as her father says. And so she went through the process of doing as much reading as she could, and we sent off 170 pages, I think, something like that.
They were amazing people to work with us, because they had such patience to bring this forward. And, you know, I think that's why I'm so emotional about watching it, is that I had to sort of dive into all the journals and writing. And, you know, I knew I wouldn't be able to do it for very long. It was sort of ripping off a Band-Aid approach, and so I would take a journal, one journal, and I'd spend the whole day just reading it without writing anything, and just pour myself a glass of wine and sit there and just read it and get through. And then once I'd done that, the next day I'd sit and without even thinking about it, just type to get the words down on paper. And the next day I would go back through and read a new journal and just absorb it for myself, and then type it back out. And I think I gave myself 2 weeks. I said whatever I got done in the 2-week period, that was what I could do. This is what ultimately developed from that.
And so they, Catherine Viner and Alan Rickman, then took that writing and they crafted the play from it. So all the words in it are Rachel's, or of what you heard from us, and Rachel's friend.
I just would, one of the things when I'm here is, you know, we do meet a lot of activists here. You know, if people don't know, we don't speak Hebrew, and the court is all in Hebrew, so we've had volunteers come, and we call it whisper translating, sit next to us in court and whisper everything that is said, so that we take notes, and we take word for word notes. So it's just been a huge and important thing. But you know, people do come up to us and say sometimes the conversations within their own family are difficult about all these issues. And I think, as my mom said, they were difficult for us when Rachel was first coming too. And you know, I think a lot of people don't realize that sometimes all it takes is a few words to start that conversation, and Rachel did that for us by writing those emails back. I remember taking one when she was still there to a friend of mine who, you know, we would never talk about anything that was going on here, and it would, you know, over coffee, and just saying, you know, you have to see this, and what do you think? And that, for me, was the first step, and that's all it took. And then within a couple of weeks, my sister had been killed. And, you know, now it's been 11 years of this being our life. So, you know, for all of you out there that are struggling sometimes to find your own words, it only takes a few little words to get the conversation started.
I'd like to ask if that's okay. Have you had any contact recently? I mean, and I remember I met you once on the seafront in Tel Aviv
Yes.
when you were having a little walk. And have you had any contact with ordinary, regular Israelis that are not part of the...
We're not activists.
The activists
We're not normal or
no sense. Ordinary red-blooded Israelis. And I'm quite curious as to whether, you know, your main experience is just the kind of stereotypical, what we would expect, or you've had more kind of profound contacts?
Most of our, Craig's always telling me, because I say to people in the U.S., I talk about the support that we have from the people here, because I think it's important for people to hear that you're here and to hear your voices. And Craig always says, well, the people that we're meeting are coming through a filter. And so, you know, we know it's not an enormous group. And we talk about the fact that many of you, I don't know if you're all activists here, but many of you thought sometimes in the past there were larger numbers, and you'd like to see those numbers grow. So yeah, most of our interactions are with people who from 2003 on, like, you know, Jeff Helper called us on the telephone. There were ads in Haaretz placed by different Israelis who identified themselves as Israeli Jews. That was extremely important to us because we had no idea how different parts, how people would respond to this, and we were really new to it all ourselves. So it was hard. I think in terms of encountering, you know, people who aren't connected to it, I'm thinking about a time in the airport. You know, it's interesting when you decide to self-identify about who you are, what your connection is. I remember sitting in an airport in LaGuardia or someplace when the airplane, you know, didn't go, and there was a couple on their way to Israel. And I'm forgetting now if they were Israeli or what their connections were. But I remember that something happened that I said who I was, and there was recognition, you know, and they looked really startled, but listened, you know, and we had a conversation. And my thought about those encounters, oh, and I remember another one now. But my thought about it is, you know, whenever we encounter each other, we get a bit more information. Our whole framework is broadened. And so I suspect that couple remembers, you know, and that maybe just having had the conversation makes some difference. The one now that I'm remembering is we were at the Royal Court Theater one night when Alan Rickman came up to us and said we needed to meet this couple from Israel who identified themselves as being part of the Likud party. And they had seen that the play was happening in London. They said, well, this is about us, this is about Israel, we need to come. And they loved it. So that was a nice, that was a very positive experience.
I think, go ahead. I was just going to say, yeah, I think, you know, if we meet somebody in a taxi or something like that, it's usually forced politeness, and so it's not confrontational.
That's not always true.
Yeah, well, maybe some exceptions. I was trying to think of positive things, though, and I do remember when we spent, you know, a total of, Cindy and I spent about 9 months up in Haifa around this trial, and Sarah, I think you were there about a year overall, off and on. And so we needed an air-conditioned place where we can get internet access. And we ended up pretty much close to living in Cafe there in Ben Gurion Street. And so sometimes late at night you'd be discussing things with the staff there. And there was one guy that had been in the Army, and pretty much all he said is that about halfway through he and the Army agreed that that wasn't the best place for him. So I don't know exactly what all that struggle was in. But, you know, we met him independently of all this, but obviously he was to the left. And after the verdict came out, he kind of pulled me aside and said, you know, this is really important. because a lot of these generals know there's certain countries in Europe they can't land in, but they never thought they'd be brought to question in an Israeli court. And it's just really important that they were questioned here. And I thought that was interesting by just some person that we, met in cafe.
When we sat in the courtroom in Haifa the day of the verdict, there were a lot of cameras and media. Some of you were there. And as we're waiting for the judge to come in, one of the cameramen leaned over to me and smiled, and he said, many people don't agree with you politically, but they respect the approach that you've made. It was a very warm gesture, I thought. So those are some of what we have encountered. We don't go around shouting who we are.
Although I will say they get recognized with, sometimes in certain communities, people will see them, or you'll see that look of sort of, do I know you? And, after there's been something on the news or in the paper. And with me, there's times you just want to be yourself. You don't want to be this big event that happened to you. And having, there was this positive side to also, it was very hard to have had to be here as long as I was. My husband was back home, and I lived here for almost a year, and it would be maybe 4 months here during this drawn-out process of the trial, and home for a month or two, and then back. And so that was very challenging. But it also did give you the ability to just, you have to go grocery shopping, and you get your hair cut, and you ride in a taxi, and you meet everybody that way. And there were times I didn't want to be known. I just wanted to be able to walk down the street and observe what just goes on in day-to-day life. And that was very important to me. And some of those observations were very, very hard and very challenging. I remember there's a memory I can't get out of my head of being in the old city. And it was around Easter, right before Easter, I believe. And we were having coffee with some friends. And this to me, it looked like this little Palestinian boy. He probably was, a very short 12-year-old, I think, maybe 10. And he was getting his cart set up to serve orange juice. And there was a group of soldiers, most of which I don't think were paying any attention to what was going on. It was sort of lunchtime and chatting, but there were probably about 20 soldiers, I think, there because it was Easter. And 3 of them started to surround this young boy because he had the knife to cut his oranges, and that was not okay with them. And this conversation went on and on and on, and I see this young boy with tears starting to fall down his face. And to me, as an adult, watching this child, you just want to protect them. And I'm looking at, in high school we had this, we called it Soch Corner. It was a little corner where all the kids, all the halls met, and you had to walk through the hall, and the big kids, the seniors, sat on the benches, and the young kids, the freshmen, had to walk through, and they'd sort of tease you or pick on you as you went through, and eventually the big kids would start to stand up for the little kids. And I felt, again, watching the soldiers who to me looked like young kids, and this little boy who looked like the little boy at our school. And I felt as an adult, I didn't know what to do. And it was the worst feeling I will ever have in my life, of sitting there not knowing how to respond to protect this child, a feeling that came back from so deep. And I looked at the soldiers and I thought, they don't see how this boy feels. They're having lunch and laughing and not realizing what it feels to this child to be surrounded in that way. And eventually, a friend of ours went over and could understand that his brother was coming, and they were going to allow him to leave, and he was allowed to leave. And we went along our way, and he was pushing his cart. We met on a different road, and one of our friends that spoke Arabic said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yes." But at that point, he just had this look of anger in his face. It went from the tears of fear to this look of frustration and anger. And I thought, again, as an adult, what do you do for that child? And what do you do for the kids that were there not understanding what the message was that was being sent to that child? And so, I have a lot of mixed feelings. I have a lot of love for many, many people here. And then there's a lot of hardship too that everybody knows and everybody sees.
Okay, so before we part, I want to say two things. First, I want to thank the magnificent Michaeli that played here. That I do not speak on behalf of the government of Israel, and I don't think it will happen soon. But I think I do speak on behalf of many Israelis when I say that we do feel responsible, we do admire your struggle, and we wish to express our solidarity.
Thank you.